Welcome to Booksphere, where we bring the world of books into a nutshell. Today, we are exploring one of the most groundbreaking books in the field of psychology and human behavior, Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This book isn't just another self-help guide. It's a deep dive into how our minds work, why we make the decisions we do, and how those decisions shape our lives. Have you ever wondered why sometimes you make choices on a whim, while other times you sit down and carefully weigh every option? Or why we tend to make the same mistakes even when we know better? Well, this book holds the answers to these questions and more. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, reveals the two systems that drive our thinking, one that's fast and intuitive and one that's slow and logical. But here's the kicker. These two systems don't always work in harmony, and understanding how they conflict can change the way you approach everything, from simple daily choices to life-changing decisions. Kahneman's insights are not just fascinating. They're actionable, giving you the tools to think smarter, avoid common cognitive traps, and make better choices in life. In this video, we'll break down the book's key concepts, explain how they apply to real-life situations, and show you why mastering your thinking can be the ultimate game changer. So, stay with us till the end, because what you're about to learn could fundamentally shift the way you view your own mind and decision-making processes. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy this content. And grab your copy of Thinking, Fast and Slow from the link in the description below. Part 1. Two Systems. In Thinking, Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman introduces the idea that the way we think and make decisions is largely driven by two systems in our minds. This concept is explored in Part 1, Two Systems, which is the foundation of the entire book. Kahneman breaks down human thinking into these two distinct systems, System 1 and System 2, and explains how they work, how they influence our decisions, and where they might lead us astray. System 1. Fast and intuitive thinking. System 1 operates automatically and quickly, with little or no effort. It's the part of your mind that kicks in when you make snap judgments or react without conscious thought. This system is always active, functioning in the background, and it governs most of our day-to-day decisions. For instance, when you see a facial expression and instantly recognize someone's emotion, or when you solve a simple math problem like 2 plus 2, that's System 1 at work. It's fast, intuitive, and operates on heuristics, mental shortcuts that help you get through your day without having to stop and deliberate over every single decision. This kind of thinking is essential because it allows us to navigate life efficiently. After all, if we had to carefully think through everything, even something as simple as walking down the street would be exhausting. However, System 1 isn't perfect. Because it relies on intuition and shortcuts, it's prone to errors, especially in complex situations. System 1 tends to jump to conclusions based on incomplete or misleading information. For example, you might judge a person's trustworthiness within seconds, relying on a gut feeling rather than careful assessment. While this can sometimes be helpful, it also means System 1 can lead to biases and irrational decisions. System 2. Slow and deliberate thinking. In contrast, System 2 is slow, deliberate, and effortful. It's what you use when you engage in more complex mental activities, such as solving a challenging math problem, evaluating multiple options, or making decisions that require careful thought. System 2 comes into play when things aren't straightforward and you need to analyze or work through something step by step. For example, when you're planning your finances for the year or figuring out the best route for a long road trip, System 2 is at work. It requires conscious effort, and because of this, we often avoid engaging it unless necessary. While System 2 is more reliable and less prone to errors than System 1, it's also more tiring. Think about how drained you feel after a long day of critical thinking or problem solving. That's System 2 fatigue. System 2 is also what we rely on to override impulsive decisions from System 1. For instance, if your intuition, System 1, tells you to make an impulse purchase, System 2 might step in and remind you that you're saving money for something more important. This system is our logical, rational thinker, but it's slower and requires more effort to engage. The interaction between System 1 and System 2. One of the key insights from this section is that these two systems don't operate in isolation. They interact constantly. System 1 makes quick judgments and guides much of our behavior. But when we face something unfamiliar or when System 1's decision seems uncertain, System 2 kicks in to take control. However, because System 2 is so effortful, we tend to rely on System 1 as much as possible, even in situations where slow, careful thinking would lead to better results. This is where many of our cognitive biases come from. For example, when you're presented with a complicated situation, you might still default to an intuitive answer from System 1, even if the situation demands more deliberate thought. It's easier, but it can lead to mistakes. This interaction explains why we often make irrational decisions, especially under stress or in situations where we don't have time to engage System 2 properly. We tend to let System 1 handle things unless we're forced to slow down and think. Examples and experiments. Kahneman illustrates the differences between these systems with several examples and experiments. One famous example is the bat and ball problem. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Most people instinctively answer 10 cents, which is the intuitive response from System 1. However, the correct answer, which requires System 2 to work it out, is 5 cents. This demonstrates how System 1 often leads us to make quick but incorrect decisions and how System 2 needs to step in for more complex reasoning. Another example is the Muller-Lyer illusion, a visual illusion that demonstrates how our intuition can mislead us even when we know better. System 1 quickly perceives the lines as being different lengths, while System 2 has to override that perception by using logic and measurement to reveal the truth. Why this matters? Understanding the two systems of thinking is essential because it helps us recognize when we are likely to fall into cognitive traps. By being aware of when we're relying too much on System 1, we can learn to engage System 2 more effectively in situations that require deeper thought. Kahneman argues that this awareness can help us avoid many of the biases and errors that plague our everyday thinking, leading to better decision-making in both personal and professional life. Part 2. Heuristics and Biases. In this section, Daniel Kahneman takes a closer look at the mental shortcuts, or heuristics, that our brains use to make quick decisions. While these shortcuts can be helpful in speeding up our thinking, they often lead us into cognitive traps, known as biases, that can distort our judgment and result in poor decisions. What are heuristics? Heuristics are mental shortcuts or rules of thumb that allow us to make decisions quickly without having to go through the slow, effortful process of analyzing every detail. These are usually based on past experiences, and in many cases, they work well for us because they save time and energy. For example, if you see dark clouds in the sky, you might quickly decide to bring an umbrella without checking the weather forecast. Your brain is relying on a heuristic that dark clouds mean rain, which is often accurate. However, while heuristics are useful for making fast decisions, they aren't always reliable. Kahneman shows that relying on them too much can lead to systematic errors, what he calls cognitive biases. These biases affect not only trivial decisions, but also crucial ones, from financial investments to professional judgments. Common heuristics and their biases. In this section of the book, Kahneman outlines several common heuristics and the biases they produce. Here are a few key ones. 1. The availability heuristic. The availability heuristic refers to our tendency to judge the likelihood or frequency of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If something is easier to recall, we assume it must happen more often or be more important. For instance, after seeing news reports about plane crashes, you might overestimate the danger of flying because those images are fresh in your memory. In reality, plane crashes are extremely rare compared to car accidents, but our minds are biased toward the information that is more readily available to us. This leads to the availability bias, where we give too much weight to memorable events and not enough to actual data. This is why people tend to overestimate the frequency of violent crimes after watching crime-heavy news shows, even if crime rates are low. 2. The anchoring effect. The anchoring heuristic occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, the anchor, when making decisions, even if that information is irrelevant. For example, if you're shopping for a car and the first price you see is $50,000, that number sets a mental anchor. Even if you see a car for $40,000 afterward, it might seem like a great deal, even if it's still overpriced for the car's value. This leads to the anchoring bias, where initial information disproportionately influences subsequent judgments, even when it shouldn't. 3. The representativeness heuristic. This heuristic involves judging the probability of an event based on how much it resembles something else. For example, if someone fits a stereotype, say a person who loves books and is quiet, you might guess they are more likely to be a librarian than a construction worker, even if statistically there are far more construction workers than librarians. This creates the representativeness bias, where we ignore actual probabilities, base rates, and rely too much on perceived similarities or stereotypes. This can lead to faulty reasoning, such as believing someone is more likely to have a certain job or personality based on superficial traits rather than real data. 4. The effect heuristic. The effect heuristic is when we let our emotions or overall impressions influence our decisions. If you have a positive feeling about a person or product, you might overlook important details, while negative feelings can make you overly critical. This heuristic can lead to the effect bias, where our emotions cloud our ability to think logically or assess situations objectively. For example, investors may make financial decisions based on how they feel about a company rather than its actual performance, leading to irrational choices. How these biases shape our decisions. Kahneman emphasizes that these heuristics and biases shape many of our everyday decisions, often without us even realizing it. They are automatic processes that System 1, the fast, intuitive part of our brain, uses to make quick judgments. However, these judgments are often flawed because they don't involve the careful, deliberate thinking of System 2. For example, if you are deciding which candidate to hire for a job, you might be influenced by the representativeness heuristic if one candidate seems to fit your idea of what a good employee looks like, even if their resume is less impressive than another candidate's. Similarly, when making investment decisions, the availability heuristic might make you overestimate the risk of a market crash if you've been hearing a lot of news about financial downturns, even if the data suggests otherwise. These biases don't just affect individuals. They can shape entire markets, politics, and societies. A CEO might make a poor business decision because they're anchored on initial cost estimates, or a voter might choose a political candidate based on how available their campaign promises are in the media, rather than a thorough analysis of the candidate's policies. The importance of recognizing biases. One of Kahneman's main points in this section is that being aware of these biases can help us make better decisions. While we can't entirely eliminate the influence of heuristics, we can train ourselves to recognize when we might be falling into a cognitive trap. Engaging System 2, our slower, more deliberate thinking, can help counteract the automatic, biased judgments of System 1. For example, if you recognize that you're being influenced by the availability heuristic, you can take a step back and look at actual data before making a decision. If you suspect you're anchoring on an initial price or estimate, you can consciously adjust your thinking by considering other factors more objectively. Kahneman doesn't suggest that we can always avoid these biases. After all, they're a fundamental part of how our minds work. But by understanding the processes behind them, we can become more mindful of our decision-making and reduce the impact of these biases on our lives. Part 3. Overconfidence. Daniel Kahneman dives into one of the most significant cognitive biases that affects both individuals and organizations: overconfidence. This section explores how our tendency to be overly optimistic about our knowledge, abilities, and future outcomes leads us to make flawed decisions and take unnecessary risks. Kahneman explains how overconfidence manifests in various aspects of our lives, from personal judgments to business and investment decisions. What is overconfidence? Overconfidence is the belief that we know more than we actually do, or that we are better at predicting future events than we truly are. It is the result of our brain's natural tendency to trust its own judgments, often more than it should. Kahneman argues that this bias is not just common. It is pervasive and can lead to serious consequences in both personal and professional settings. We often overestimate our abilities to assess situations accurately and underestimate the likelihood of failure or setbacks. For example, people might feel highly confident in their ability to predict the stock market. Yet research consistently shows that even experts struggle to predict market movements with any reliability. Similarly, managers might feel certain about the success of a new product launch, even when the data suggests a much higher risk of failure. Kahneman describes overconfidence as one of the most dangerous biases because it prevents us from seeing the full picture and making well-informed decisions. It leads us to take risks that we otherwise wouldn't if we had a more balanced view of our knowledge and abilities. The illusion of understanding. One key concept Kahneman introduces in this part is the illusion of understanding. This is the false belief that we understand the world and how it works better than we actually do. We are constantly bombarded with information, stories, and explanations, and our brains automatically create a coherent narrative that makes sense to us. However, this narrative often oversimplifies complex realities. For example, after major events like financial crashes, political upheavals, or natural disasters, people often claim they saw it coming. In hindsight, it seems obvious that these events would occur. However, before the event, very few, if any, people predicted it with accuracy. Kahneman points out that after-the-fact explanations give us a sense of clarity and understanding that we didn't actually have beforehand. This leads to overconfidence in our ability to predict future events. Kahneman also talks about the role of stories in reinforcing this illusion. We often construct simple narratives to explain complex phenomena, but these stories can be misleading. For instance, a business might succeed due to a mix of factors like timing, market conditions, and luck, but we often attribute success solely to the CEO's leadership or a single smart decision. This oversimplified understanding makes us overconfident in similar future decisions. The planning fallacy. Another critical concept Kahneman discusses is the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of completing a project while overestimating its benefits. This bias affects both individuals and organizations. For example, have you ever started a project thinking it would take a couple of hours, only to find yourself still working on it days later? That's the planning fallacy at work. We are overly optimistic about how quickly and easily we can accomplish tasks, which leads to missed deadlines and unexpected costs. This bias is particularly problematic in large projects, such as government initiatives or corporate ventures, where delays and cost overruns are common. Kahneman explains that the planning fallacy occurs because we focus too much on the specifics of the current project and fail to account for potential obstacles or setbacks. We base our predictions on an ideal scenario, ignoring past experiences where things took longer or went wrong. To counter this bias, Kahneman suggests using the outside view, looking at similar past projects to get a more realistic estimate of time and costs, rather than relying on our optimistic internal projections. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, or the "I knew it all along" effect, is another key aspect of overconfidence that Kahneman highlights. After something has happened, it feels obvious that it was going to happen, and we convince ourselves that we knew it all along. This bias reinforces our overconfidence because we believe we were better at predicting events than we really were. For instance, after a company's stock value plummets, investors might say, "I knew that was going to happen," but did they really know? Or are they simply rewriting their memory to fit the current reality? Hindsight bias not only distorts our memory of past decisions, but also makes us more confident in our future judgments because we think we have a clearer understanding of how things work. Overconfidence in experts. Kahneman also tackles the issue of overconfidence in experts. While we might assume that experts are better at making predictions than the average person, Kahneman's research shows that even experts are highly susceptible to overconfidence. In fact, the more specialized an expert becomes, the more likely they are to be overconfident in their judgments. For example, Stock market analysts, political commentators, and business strategists often make bold predictions about the future, yet they are frequently wrong. Despite this, their confidence remains high. Kahneman points out that expertise in a field does not necessarily translate to better predictions, especially in complex, uncertain environments where chance plays a significant role. In fields like economics, politics, and finance, experts often fail to outperform simple statistical models, yet their confidence in their ability to predict remains unwavering. Kahneman's research shows that experts are often more confident than accurate, and this overconfidence can lead to flawed decision-making at the highest levels. The engine of capitalism, optimism bias. Interestingly, Kahneman notes that a certain level of overconfidence or optimism bias is not only common but also necessary for entrepreneurship and innovation. Entrepreneurs, for instance, often overestimate their chances of success and underestimate the risks involved in starting a business. While this optimism can lead to failure for many, it is also the driving force behind progress and innovation. Kahneman describes optimism as the engine of capitalism, because without the belief that things will work out, many businesses and projects would never be attempted. This bias fuels risk-taking and creative ventures, and while many will fail, those that succeed drive economic growth and technological advancements. In this sense, a moderate level of overconfidence can be beneficial for society, even though it leads to frequent individual failures. How to counter overconfidence. While Kahneman acknowledges that overconfidence is hardwired into our thinking, he offers some strategies to counter it. 1. Be aware of biases. Simply being aware of overconfidence and other cognitive biases can help you recognize when you're falling into these traps. Awareness allows you to take a step back and question your assumptions and judgments. 2. Use the outside view. Instead of relying solely on your own predictions, look at similar situations or projects from the past to get a more realistic estimate of outcomes. This can help you avoid the planning fallacy and other optimistic biases. 3. Embrace uncertainty. Accept that the future is inherently unpredictable and be cautious when making confident predictions. Recognize the limits of your knowledge and avoid making decisions based on overconfident forecasts. 4. Consult multiple perspectives. Rather than relying on a single viewpoint or expert opinion, consult a variety of perspectives and data points to reduce the influence of individual overconfidence. Part 4. Choices. In this section, Daniel Kahneman delves into how we make decisions, especially when faced with risk and uncertainty. This part of the book builds on insights from both psychology and economics, specifically focusing on prospect theory, which Kahneman developed with his colleague Amos Tversky. The key theme of this section is that our decision-making is not purely rational or based solely on objective evaluations. Instead, it is influenced by biases, emotions, and framing. Kahneman challenges the traditional economic assumption that humans are rational agents who always make decisions in their best interest. Instead, he demonstrates how System 1 thinking, fast, automatic, and emotional, often leads us astray when making choices, especially under uncertainty. The basics of prospect theory. At the heart of Part 4 is prospect theory, which describes how people evaluate potential gains and losses. Prospect theory is an alternative to the traditional expected utility theory used in economics, which assumes that people make decisions by weighing the expected outcomes and choosing the one with the highest utility, satisfaction. However, Kahneman shows that in reality, people do not make choices purely based on logic. Instead, they are highly influenced by how the choices are framed and how they perceive gains and losses. One of the most striking findings of prospect theory is that people tend to fear losses more than they value gains, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. Loss aversion. People feel the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of the same value. For example, losing $100 feels much worse than the joy of gaining $100. This leads people to make overly cautious decisions when they perceive a potential loss, even if the risk is small. Kahneman explains that our aversion to loss can drive irrational decision-making. For instance, investors might hold on to losing stocks for too long because they want to avoid the emotional pain of realizing a loss, even when selling the stock would be the rational decision. The value function in prospect theory. Kahneman introduces the value function in prospect theory to explain how people assign value to potential outcomes. The function is S-shaped, reflecting two critical psychological insights. 1. Losses loom larger than gains. This means that the negative feelings associated with losing are much more intense than the positive feelings associated with winning the same amount. The value function is steeper in the loss domain than in the gain domain, demonstrating that people are loss-averse. 2. Diminishing sensitivity. As the amount of a gain or loss increases, the emotional impact diminishes. For instance, the difference between losing $100 and $200 feels more significant than the difference between losing $1,000 and $1,100, even though both involve a $100 loss. This diminishing sensitivity also applies to gains. Winning $100 feels great, but winning $1,100 versus $1,000 doesn't feel as substantial. This value function explains why people might take big risks to avoid losses, but become risk-averse when it comes to securing gains. Kahneman uses the example of gambling. People are more willing to gamble when they're trying to avoid a sure loss, but they become more conservative when they're trying to secure a sure gain. Framing effects. Another crucial concept discussed in Part 4 is the framing effect. The way a decision is presented or framed can drastically affect the choice people make. Kahneman demonstrates that people are highly sensitive to whether options are framed in terms of gains or losses, even when the underlying outcomes are the same. For example, imagine you are presented with two options for a medical treatment. Option A: this treatment has a 90% survival rate. Option B: this treatment has a 10% mortality rate. Although both statements describe the same situation, people tend to feel more positive toward option A because it is framed in terms of survival, a gain, while option B emphasizes mortality, a loss. This highlights how easily our decisions can be influenced by how choices are framed. Framing effects reveal that people do not consistently evaluate outcomes based on objective criteria. Instead, the emotional impact of how information is presented can sway decisions, often leading to irrational behavior. The certainty effect and the possibility effect. Kahneman also discusses two important phenomena related to decision-making under uncertainty: the certainty effect and the possibility effect. Certainty effect. People tend to overvalue outcomes that are certain compared to those that are merely probable. This is why many people prefer a guaranteed outcome, even if it is less valuable than a probabilistic one with a higher expected value. For example, people may prefer a guaranteed $500 over a 50% chance of winning $1,200, even though the second option has a higher expected value, $600. The certainty of the first option makes it more attractive. Possibility effect. On the flip side, people also overvalue small probabilities, which can explain why people buy lottery tickets or take large risks for the possibility of a huge reward, even when the chances of success are extremely low. The emotional appeal of even a slim chance of winning big leads people to make irrational bets. These effects show how our minds are biased toward both certainty and possibility, leading us to make inconsistent choices when faced with risk and uncertainty. Risk and reference points. A key concept in Part 4 is that people make decisions based on a reference point, which is their current situation or expectation. Whether an outcome is perceived as a gain or a loss depends on this reference point. For example, if someone expects to receive a $1,000 bonus but only receives $500, they will perceive it as a loss relative to their expectation, even though $500 is objectively a gain. This explains why people react differently to the same outcome depending on their expectations. If an investment performs better than expected, it feels like a gain, but if it performs worse than expected, it feels like a loss, even if the outcome is objectively positive. Kahneman also shows that people often use inappropriate reference points when making decisions, which leads to irrational choices. For instance, An investor might anchor their decision to hold or sell a stock based on the price they originally paid for it, rather than its current value or future prospects. This leads to status quo bias, the preference for keeping things as they are because changing them would involve acknowledging a loss relative to the reference point. Mental accounting. In this section, Kahneman also touches on the concept of mental accounting, where people compartmentalize money into different categories based on its origin or intended use, even though money is fungible, meaning $1 is the same no matter where it comes from. For example, someone might be reluctant to dip into their savings to pay off a credit card debt, even though it would be financially wiser to do so because they have mentally labeled that money as for emergencies rather than for paying debts. Similarly, people may spend more freely when they receive a bonus than when they earn money through regular work because they treat the bonus as found money rather than part of their regular income. Mental accounting can lead to poor financial decisions, such as failing to optimize resources or taking unnecessary risks based on arbitrary categories. How to make better choices. To conclude Part 4, Kahneman offers some insights on how to improve decision-making, especially in high-stakes situations involving risk and uncertainty. 1. Acknowledge biases. By understanding the biases that affect our choices, such as loss aversion and the framing effect, we can take steps to counteract them. Simply being aware of these biases helps reduce their influence on our decisions. 2. Reframe decisions. Try to frame decisions in multiple ways to see how the framing affects your judgment. For instance, instead of just looking at a decision in terms of potential losses, consider how the same choice looks when framed as a gain. This can help you make more balanced choices. 3. Use probabilities, not certainties. Instead of focusing on certain outcomes, consider the probabilities of various outcomes and their expected values. This can help you avoid the certainty effect and possibility effect, which lead to poor risk management. 4. Consider the outside view. Instead of relying on your internal assumptions and predictions, use data from similar past situations to guide your decisions. This can help you avoid overconfidence and better assess risks. 5. Delay emotional decisions. When faced with a risky decision, give yourself time to process it and consider it from different angles. This helps counteract the emotional pull of loss aversion and framing effects. Part 5. Two Selves. Daniel Kahneman explores the concept of how we experience life and make decisions based on two different aspects of ourselves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. These two selves perceive reality in distinct ways, and Kahneman shows how this difference significantly impacts the way we evaluate our happiness, satisfaction, and the choices we make. The experiencing self versus the remembering self. The experiencing self is the part of us that lives in the present moment. It experiences things as they happen in real time, whether it's joy, pain, or boredom. The experiencing self is concerned with how we feel right now. For example, if you're enjoying a meal or feeling uncomfortable in a chair, it's the experiencing self that is registering those sensations and emotions. The remembering self, on the other hand, is the part of us that looks back on past experiences and evaluates them. It constructs memories and narratives about events that have already occurred. Unlike the experiencing self, the remembering self doesn't recall every moment equally, but rather focuses on key highlights, specifically the peak moments and the end of an experience. This self plays a crucial role in how we make decisions for the future, based not on how we felt throughout an experience, but on how we remember it. Kahneman emphasizes that these two selves often come into conflict, and understanding the distinction between them helps explain many paradoxes in human behavior. Key insights from the two selves. 1. Peak-end rule. One of the most significant insights from Part 5 is the peak-end rule, which describes how the remembering self evaluates past experiences. According to this rule, the overall memory of an experience is not based on the total sum of pleasure or pain experienced, but rather on two key factors. The peak moment, the most intense part of the experience, whether positive or negative. The end moment, how the experience concluded. These two moments disproportionately shape our memories. For instance, if you go on a vacation and have an incredible moment of joy at one point and a relatively pleasant end, you will likely remember the trip as fantastic, even if there were boring or difficult moments in between. This insight shows that we often make decisions about future experiences based on these flawed memories. The remembering self, in essence, writes the story of our lives, and it's more concerned with creating memorable experiences than optimizing ongoing happiness. 2. Duration neglect. Another key concept is duration neglect, which refers to the fact that the length of an experience has very little impact on how we remember it. Whether a painful procedure lasts 30 minutes or 10 minutes doesn't make a significant difference to the remembering self, as long as the peak and end moments are the same. This explains why people can recall long, arduous experiences more fondly than shorter, but less intense ones if the peak and end moments were handled better. For example, imagine undergoing a medical procedure. If the worst part of the procedure is at the beginning and it gradually gets better toward the end, you are more likely to remember it favorably, even if the total procedure lasts longer because the end was less painful. This tendency of the remembering self to neglect duration affects how we make choices for the future. 3. The conflict between the two selves. The differences between the experiencing self and the remembering self can create internal conflicts, particularly when it comes to decision-making. The experiencing self wants to maximize comfort and pleasure in the present moment, while the remembering self prioritizes creating meaningful and memorable experiences that it can look back on with satisfaction. A classic example of this conflict is when people endure difficult or challenging activities, such as running a marathon or climbing a mountain. During the event, the experiencing self may feel intense discomfort, fatigue, or even pain. However, the remembering self focuses on the sense of accomplishment and the peak moments, leading people to recall the experience fondly and even want to repeat it. This explains why people often make choices that their experiencing self might regret, such as signing up for another marathon, because the remembering self is in control of how the past experience is framed. 4. Happiness versus life satisfaction. Kahneman makes a distinction between momentary happiness and overall life satisfaction, linking them to the two selves. Happiness, or well-being, is what the experiencing self feels. It is a measure of how pleasant or unpleasant the present moment is. For instance, being engaged in an enjoyable conversation or savoring a delicious meal boosts the experiencing self's happiness. Life satisfaction, however, is a judgment made by the remembering self. It's influenced by how we recall past events, how we compare ourselves to others, and whether we feel we are meeting our goals. Life satisfaction depends on the narrative we create about our lives, and the remembering self plays a dominant role in shaping this narrative. Because these two aspects of well-being are evaluated differently by the two selves, they don't always align. For example, someone may live a life full of pleasant daily experiences, high momentary happiness, but feel unsatisfied with their overall life due to unmet goals or negative comparisons, low life satisfaction. Implications for decision-making. The distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self has profound implications for how we make decisions. Often, we prioritize decisions that satisfy the remembering self, aiming for memorable achievements, accolades, or peak experiences, while neglecting the happiness of the experiencing self. This leads people to choose challenging or even unpleasant activities, like pursuing a stressful career or undertaking a difficult adventure, because the remembering self values the story or narrative it can create from these experiences. However, Kahneman suggests that we should be mindful of the biases of the remembering self. By recognizing how the peak-end rule and duration neglect distort our memories, we can make more balanced decisions that also consider the needs of the experiencing self. In other words, while creating meaningful memories is important, we should also focus on enhancing the quality of our moment-to-moment experiences. Conclusion. Daniel Kahneman's thinking, Fast and Slow, offers a groundbreaking exploration of the human mind, revealing how we think, make decisions, and form judgments. The central theme of the book revolves around the idea that our thinking is governed by two distinct systems. System 1, which is fast, intuitive, and emotional, and System 2, which is slow, deliberate, and logical. Through the book's 5 parts, Kahneman delves into how these two systems influence our lives, often in ways we aren't even aware of. System 1 is crucial for everyday decisions, allowing us to act swiftly and efficiently in familiar situations. However, it's also prone to biases and errors, leading us to make snap judgments based on incomplete information. On the other hand, System 2 is more accurate but requires effort, energy, and time, which is why we often rely on System 1, even when deeper thought is necessary. Key lessons from the book. 1. Cognitive biases and heuristics. Kahneman explains how cognitive shortcuts, or heuristics, help us navigate the world but often lead us to systematic errors. The availability heuristic, for instance, leads us to judge the probability of events based on how easily we can recall similar events. The anchoring effect makes us heavily rely on initial information, the anchor, when making decisions. These biases reveal the limitations of intuitive thinking. 2. Prospect theory and decision-making. Kahneman, along with his colleague Amos Tversky, developed prospect theory, which revolutionized how we understand decision-making under uncertainty. One of the key ideas here is that people value losses and gains differently. Losses hurt more than gains feel good. This concept explains risk-averse behaviors and the tendency to avoid losses, even at the expense of making optimal choices. 3. Overconfidence and the illusion of understanding. Kahneman shows how overconfidence can skew our judgment, leading us to overestimate our abilities and the accuracy of our predictions. We often think we know more than we actually do, and we create narratives to explain the past, even though reality is much more random and unpredictable than we like to believe. 4. The role of emotion and intuition. Emotions play a significant role in System 1 thinking, affecting how we make decisions and interpret the world. While emotions can guide us, especially in high-stakes or complex situations, they can also distort our judgment. Kahneman urges us to be aware of how intuition can both help and hinder sound decision-making. 5. The two selves, experiencing versus remembering. One of the most powerful insights in the book is the distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is concerned with how we feel in the moment, while the remembering self builds a narrative about past events. This difference helps explain why our memories can be at odds with our moment-to-moment experiences, and why we sometimes make choices that prioritize the remembering self's need for meaning and satisfaction over the experiencing self's pursuit of comfort or happiness. Final thoughts. Thinking fast and slow challenges us to rethink how we approach decision-making, highlighting the importance of critical thinking, awareness of biases, and the need to slow down when faced with complex or significant choices. Kahneman's work has profound implications for various fields, including economics, politics, medicine, and personal development. It empowers us to better understand our thought processes and make more informed, rational decisions, rather than relying solely on gut feelings and intuition. By recognizing when to engage System 2, even when it feels uncomfortable or slow, we can make choices that lead to better outcomes. At the same time, Kahneman reminds us to be humble in our assessments, acknowledging the role of randomness and uncertainty in life. Through this awareness, we can guard against overconfidence, reduce errors in judgment, and enhance our overall decision-making abilities. Ultimately, thinking fast and slow provides readers with the tools to understand and navigate their own minds, leading to wiser, more thoughtful choices in both personal and professional contexts. Thank you for watching this detailed breakdown of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. If you found these insights helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with your friends and family who might also benefit from these powerful concepts. And if you're interested in diving deeper into the world of decision-making and human psychology, feel free to pick up a copy of the book using the link in the description. Also, Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you'll be alerted whenever we upload more book summaries that can help you grow both personally and professionally. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.